Chilling tales for dark nights.
Why I Was Released from Prison. Written by Seamus Coffey. Performed by Henrique Couto. On February 12th of 2002, I was convicted of violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986 and nearly 24 other related crimes. I was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security prison. On June 2nd of 2002, I was released from prison and sent on my way. I was not placed on probation or parole. Those not intimately familiar with my case might scoff at the above statements, but they are completely factual. It is the events that occurred during that 4-month period that are the reason my sentence was commuted and I was sent home. I arrived at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri on February 13th of 2002 at roughly 9 in the morning. The 2 U.S. Marshals who delivered me handed the intake officer a stack of paperwork and signed a form before leaving me in the care of the Bureau of Prisons. I was 18 years old and wet behind the ears. I had a lengthy juvenile record, but this was the big leagues. A guard read through my intake form and said, "Hacker, huh? You a homo or something?" I replied, "No, of course not." He laughed. "If you're a homo, you should tell me now. Homos go to a special cell block." He proceeded to do a cavity search and corralled me into a shower where he sprayed me with a hose and then issued me my prisoner uniform, shoes, belt, hygiene supplies, a towel, blanket, and a badge with my prisoner number on it. I was lucky. I had been assigned to C Block. C Block had private rooms and a common area. My room was a 10-foot by 6-foot cell that had a single bunk, a jail toilet with a sink in the basin, and a locker that served as a nightstand and a table. There was a camera in the upper left-hand corner over this 3-inch thick steel door with a single tempered glass window at just about eye level. Okay, so now that I've given you an idea of what kind of place I was at, let me get down to brass tacks. This was a giant stone building where every imaginable evil was committed on a daily basis for the better part of 70 years by the time I'd got there. I'm not asking you to believe in ghosts, but that prison is haunted. Inmates would report hearing rustling noises outside their doors or knocking on the walls behind their cells. Nearly everyone on C Block had a story about Old Jim. Old Jim was a guard during the riot of 1941. Legend has it he turned the corner onto C Block and the inmates tackled him to the ground and raped him to death. Other versions of the story claim they raped him and then stabbed him. The point is, he died horribly. On some nights, when we were supposed to be asleep, we'd stand at our meal flaps and have conversations through the crack. Every now and then we'd hear keys jingling and footsteps in the hall. If anyone was brave enough to look up, they'd see nothing, if they were lucky. Anyone that reported to have looked Old Jim in the eyes was called a liar. As the story goes, if you look Old Jim in the eyes, he'll come to your cell and kill you. More than one inmate had been found mutilated in their cell over the years. Even with the cameras in place, there was no evidence that anyone had been in the cell aside from the victim. We traded Old Jim sightings like campfire stories, but he was far from the only ghost. My cell in particular was especially terrifying. Unlike most cells, I had a grate in my ceiling. It had been bolted up with mesh wire, but that didn't stop a previous occupant from making rope out of his sheet and hanging himself. Some nights when it was dark and everyone was asleep, I'd wake up and see this guy dangling over me. I'd close my eyes as quickly as I could. I asked Sarge, one of the inmates I had developed a bit of a friendship with, about it. He said that it was this Nazi guy that died in my cell back in the 50s. A nasty storm rolled in one afternoon and knocked the power out. That evening, the backup generators had gone out. C Block was on lockdown. The guard sat in his office smoking as the rest of us were forced to do without. We could smoke on an enclosed stoop 4 times a day, but even the electric lighter on the wall was about useless at that point. The snoring from the end of the hall meant the guard was asleep. Larry was a good guy and none of us had a problem with him. He had a habit of falling asleep, and most nights that wouldn't have been a problem, but the magnetic doors weren't working. The main door to the cell block still used a key, but all the interior doors had been upgraded. Larry was asleep in an unlocked office that contained a load of contraband on a cell block that housed 2 serial killers, a Marine that went on a rampage, about a dozen killers, 4 terrorists, and a hacker. It did not end well for him. Tyrell was a gangbanger from Chicago convicted of killing a DEA agent. Larry had busted Tyrell several times for trying to gain entry to the hygiene cabinet in the guard office. Larry was asleep and Tyrell wasn't confined to his cell. Larry didn't even have a chance to scream. I doubt he even woke up. Tyrell grabbed Larry's nightstick and his keys. As he went for the door, we all heard a jingling noise that sent all of us back to our cells. I didn't watch, but what I heard was bad enough. Tyrell screamed, and then I heard him being dragged across the floor and down the hall. His hands made wet slaps against the smooth tile as he tried to pull himself from old Jim's grip. We heard the shower come on and one final scream before the keys began jingling down the hall again. I looked up from my position crouching inside the door and saw the Nazi hanging there. I heard him say the phrase, "Gott ist tot." Bernie, a former dentist and convicted serial killer, lived in the cell across the hall from me. I heard Bernie shout, but I was paralyzed with fear. It was only when I saw the Nazi clawing at his noose that I moved out of the door with my eyes to the floor and headed for the common room. By this point, everyone was screaming. Everyone, that is, except Sarge. Sarge reached out of his door and grabbed my shoulder. I would have liked to have had a heart attack right there on the spot, but he pulled me in and told me to be quiet. Sarge wasn't innocent. He openly admitted to his crimes, something that was rare in prison. While he was deployed to Iraq during Desert Storm, 2 men broke into his house and kidnapped his daughter. He received the news after returning from a mission. At that very moment, he went AWOL, found his way back to the States, and tracked those men down. By the time he was finished, you could have fit their remains in a shoebox. He turned himself in the next day. Sarge whispered,
"I think you'll be fine, but I'm done for."
I whispered back, "What do you mean?"
"Huh?"
Sarge got close and said,
"All of us are lifers who deserve to be here. You fiddled with a computer, big whoop. Look, kid, my grandmother was a medicine woman and told me restless spirits can only hurt the damned. I don't think you're damned."
I replied, "But
I'm an atheist."
He laughed quietly.
"Does this look like a situation where it makes sense to be an atheist?"
I shook my head. The jingling sound was getting closer. By this point, the lights were flickering but weren't coming back on just yet. I looked up just as the lights flickered, and when it went dark again, I was staring old Jim directly in the eyes. Sarge shouted at the apparition,
"Hey, ugly! I heard you went out crying for your mama!"
Old Jim turned his head towards Sarge and knocked him to the ground. He then reached down and grabbed Sarge by the leg. Sarge looked back at me, shouting,
"Get somewhere safe and don't open your eyes until the guards pull you out."
He said this as he was dragged away. About a minute later, I heard bones crunching and Sarge screaming as I ran for the main door. The key was still in the lock. I turned it and ran to the smoking stoop. I sat there with my eyes closed for the next several hours. The sun came up, and with it came several guards that pulled me off the smoking stoop. I didn't respond. I was all but catatonic at that point. I had seen things no one should ever see and lived. I was moved to solitary for the better part of a week, and even still I didn't respond when questioned. It was only when I was brought to the warden that I started showing any sign of being mentally present. The warden had me brought to his office and I was put in a chair. He offered me some soda, but I didn't respond. Then he clasped his hands behind his back and walked over to his desk. After sitting down, he said, "This happened back in 44 and again in 59. Before my time, mind you, but I read the reports. Never had a survivor before. Honestly, we don't know what to do with you." I looked up at him. He smiled and continued, "I talked to a friend of mine with the federal prosecutor's office, and he said you're a non-violent offender that broke a computer or something and made some threats. He and I had a talk with an appellate judge we know, and he ruled that certain evidence in your trial should have been ruled inadmissible. I relaxed a bit more and sat back in the chair as a slight grin came to my face. The warden offered me a soda. I said, "Yes, please." He then said, "I believe prison should be about rehabilitation more than incarceration. A lot of the sociopaths need to be locked away, but the ones that can be reformed should be reformed. Do you understand what I'm getting at?" I nodded. He continued, "I can't speak to whether or not you are a sociopath. That's a job for a psychiatrist. But you survived something that has on more than one occasion killed every last inmate on that block. Someone or something decided that you should live. Who am I to argue with a higher power?" He got up and turned toward the window. "Tomorrow morning, a pair of marshals will drive you to an airport in St. Louis where you'll be flown to Nashville, Tennessee and released into your own custody. Your sentence has been commuted to time served without probation or parole." He paused, and I said, "Thank you, sir." The warden turned around, and with an expression that looked like an equal mix of fear and sadness, he said, "I try not to think about the kinds of spirits that might inhabit this place, but you saw them firsthand. The official policy when an event like this happens in a government facility is to purge the records and deny any occurrence of supernatural activity. Now, I can't stop you from telling your story, but do me a favor and wait until I'm dead. I'd rather be safe in the Lord's arms when you reveal what really happened that night." I was led back to solitary confinement and released the next morning. I've kept this story to myself for the better part of 13 years now. To this day, I jump when I hear keys jingling at night. I've gotten by this long by trying to rationalize what I saw or why I saw it, but I don't have any answers that even begin to make sense. I kept my promise, though. Warden Michaels died last week at the age of 57.
Teddy Bears and Tea Parties. Written by Samuel Boyd Taylor. Performed by Jason Hill. With her hands still shaking, the little girl wipes a circle of blood clean from the kitchen window. Her pinky is missing, still bleeding where it's been cut off. She knows he's out there, watching. There. The shadow between the hungry-eyed houses, short, round man on a unicycle, tall hat, flat teeth, no eyes. Just an eyeball he stole and a monocle loop that he holds to his forehead with four-fingered hands. The little girl puts the teddy bear by the sink, a ratty old bear with greasy olive-colored fur. She hopes it's the last one alive. Dead teddy bears fill the kitchen counters beside her, each killed in different ways. One with its head severed and grape jelly blood still spurting thick and gloppy onto the floor. One dismembered, one burning on the stove, giving off thick, grape-scented smoke. Careful of the claws, she checks the toaster cords that bind the last bear's wrists. She tries to remember his name so she can question him, but her sister had so many bears.
Are you going to kill me too?"
he asks.
"Where are the others?"
He cringes and whimpers but does not answer. She glances at the knife lying on the stained counter.
"Don't kill me." "You work for him. That thing outside. After all those years keeping us safe, you let him touch you, change you."
The little girl picks up the knife. It's as long as her arm, blade sticky with jelly.
I'll tell you anything. Just don't kill me." "Where are the others hiding?" "In the attic."
The girl pulls the knife close to the bear's neck. It hisses and shows its vampire fangs.
"Don't kill me. Don't you love me anymore?" "Where's Angie? Where's my sister?" He has her."
"Where?"
"I don't know."
She saws a single gash across his cheek. Olive fur separates, a purple smile. So pretty. So pretty. He screams, and she keeps him screaming.
I don't know where she is,
he says when she stops cutting.
Don't kill me. I still love you.
I love you too. One more cut and he falls in half. The purple blood stains deep. Her apron, her palms, her lips. It smells so sweet. She licks it. Concord grapes. Her belly leaps and growls for more. She opens the door to the living room and peers in. Every shadow looks dangerous, like it could move, jump, dig its fangs into her throat. The ceiling pillows down, water-stained with brown clouds. Without even looking for them, she sees the twisted faces hidden in the pattern. Her parents' faces, the neighbors' faces, everyone the house has ever eaten, staring down at her. They are the house, and the house is hungry. The faces can't get you, she tells herself. It's daytime, and there aren't any bears. Just a few more steps, get past the couch. Don't be scared, don't be scared, don't be scared. Shadows move on the mantelpiece and the end tables. She freezes. The family pictures are moving. Brass frames buckling into bow-shaped mouths. They want to eat her. Don't be scared, she says. Of course they're hungry. Everything must eat, and there isn't much food these days. One picture is starved to death. She knows because it doesn't move. Only dead things are still. The picture is Angie. Eyes like blue diamonds, all straw hair and smiles, having a tea party with the teddy bears. Before the magic came back. Before everything came alive. The stairs creak and sag under her feet. One even whines like a hungry dog. Shh, she tells it. I'll feed you later. The stairs say again. She hears footsteps in the hall, soft whooshes on the rotten rug that sound like tiny voices whispering, murder, murder, murder. Her stained hand grips the banister so hard her bones hurt. When she crawls into the attic, she slips on the grape-flavored blood. A dozen teddy bears are scattered with long purple smiles around their necks, spilling jelly onto the greedy floor. She hears someone crying and wonders if it's her sister. Angie? No answer. Just the boards creaking, saying they're hungry. Haven't you had enough blood? But there's never enough blood. She follows the voices and finds Ollie Cat behind the big box of shining Christmas stars. His Oliver Twist clothes are soaked red. A new scent. Strawberries. She didn't know there were other flavors. Her belly reaches out toward the plush cat. You killed the other bears? He starts crying. We were so afraid of you, of what you would do. We didn't want to suffer. They asked me to kill them. She stares. Her eyes are empty mouths. Why did one of them stab you? Silence. Then, I still love you. You all say that. The pull-string loop that makes Ollie Cat purr has a thumb stuck in it. Angie's thumb. Bit off my bare teeth. The little girl takes it, tucks it in her stained apron. What did you do with Angie? He tries to crawl away, but he is too weak. His jelly-filled body folds in on itself and quivers. She pulls the string, forces him to purr, drags him back under the knife. He pisses himself then. Sweet strawberry piss. She thinks of Angie, straw hair and smiles. Then she thinks of the thumb.
I'm going to make you hurt. A lot. Okay?
Okay, he whimpers. She loves strawberries. She sees him out there, hiding behind the street corner on his unicycle, staring at her with eyeless eyes. She moves from window to window, but he is always there. She knows he has her sister, he has Angie, but the little girl is too scared to face him. All she can do is listen to his unicycle creak, creak, creak as he pedals around the house. On the third day, the bear blood runs out. By the next day, she is starving, and the house is starving too. The faces in the ceiling start following her around and smiling at her. Always, always smiling. If she doesn't leave soon, they will eat her. She licks the purple stain on her palm because it is sweet, but every lick she remembers teddy bears screaming and dying. She tries to scrape it off with her fingernails, but no matter how much she licks or scrapes, it will not come out. The little girl holds the knife in front of her and opens the door. He creaks back and forth on his unicycle beside the rusted swing on the front lawn.
How are you?
He says. The hungry houses behind him lean toward her. Boards creak, bricks pour powdered mortar like blood. Hungry?
I gave you blood.
There's never enough blood. He smiles with black lips.
Do you know who I am?
Angie knew. You're him.
No, I'm him. Like the song, like the psalm on your palm.
She spreads her 4 fingers wide and sees her scraping has reduced the stain to shapes. Words, no, not words, thoughts. She cuts them away with the knife because they say the truth, but no matter how deep she cuts, they stay. When the skin is gone, her blood starts singing with words that aren't words until they echo down from the sky, and she is crying now. She has never cried before. Her tears taste like strawberries and grapes.
Where is my sister? Where did you hide all the children?
He eats her then. Black mouth stretches wider than the sky. She falls, and the falling is like flying, soft wind, sweet and cool, freedom. Her hand sings to her, but she can't understand it anymore. The notes shiver her blood. She opens her eyes, and the stomach is huge around her, dark and dank above, the echo of water dripping, subterranean vastness with hungry shadows. She follows hints of light, wondering where the light comes from. Then she realizes that the light comes from her, bloody hand burning bright. Where she carved away the words, she presses her red palm forward, 4 fingers singing against the darkness. Soon, she finds a wall, moist, fleshy, hundreds of eyeballs set deep in the skin, monocle loops glisten like the halos of devils. Each eye stares at her in turn. Black tongues where the pupils should be, hungry mouths eating up the light of her. Her hand begins to fade, and she feels dry and brittle and sandy inside. A doll full of sawdust, barely any blood. She runs away from the wall of eyes, away from the hunger and the naked need. Angie sits in the shadows at a table with 2 steaming teacups. But Angie isn't Angie anymore. Her face is china and glimmers with blue and purple and silver underneath, black opal eyes half-lidded. Her straw hair is silky now, but the wrong texture. He stole your eyes. Sit down, says Angie. Have some tea. Her lips and cheeks are bright strawberry, but they don't move when she speaks. She is too perfect, too still. Only dead things are still. The little girl peers into the cups, hollow white and painted with shadow. There isn't any tea, Angie. Just steam. Empty steam. Oh, all you have to do is sit, be still. Just for a moment. Is that what you did? Be still? It's what we all do, eventually. The girl holds up her hand and burns the darkness back with her fading soul. 100 tables shine back, countless dolls sitting in broken circles, pale china faces so still. You can't fight him, you know. Sit down. Be still. I'm too hungry to be still. I'm not hungry. If you sit, you won't be either. Silence like ice between them. Angie remains perfect and pale. The little girl sweats and steams. Do you have my thumb? Angie asks at last. I ate it. Ate it? So hungry, you don't know. The whole world is starving since the magic came back. The houses, the teddy bears, the swing sets. Everything has to eat now. Everything has blood. The girl licks her lips, remembers the Concord grapes. Angie's voice sounds scared. You're thinking about eating me too, aren't you? No, the little girl lies. I came to rescue you, to bring you back. To what? There's nothing left. There has to be something left. Oh, you can't beat him. Sit down. Rest. Just for 1 second. I'm taking you home, Angie. I don't want to go. I like it here. You will too. The little girl steals Angie then, tucks her under her right arm, and runs. The girl doesn't know where she's going until she gets there. The wall of eyes. She stops when she sees it, awed by the size and the countless glistening monocle loops. How many eyes does he have? She asks. All of them. The eyes turn toward her again, one by one, as she walks past. The red light from her hand flickers, fades. Sand starts to scrub inside her veins. They eat up the light of you, Angie says. They turn you into sawdust in China, the hungry eyes with black tongues. You're the milk. They're the cats. Just a little further, the little girl tells herself. Her breath comes in short gasps. She's so hungry. Her stomach feels full of cold, gnashing teeth. What are you looking for anyway? You'll never find it. Then the little girl stops and points. Look, Angie, your eyes. Blue diamonds. Blue diamonds. She sets Angie down and pulls the knife from her apron. The blade a slice of fire in the shadows. She grabs a fistful of flesh and slime. She pulls herself up, stabs with the knife, pulls herself up farther. The nearest eye licks her with its black tongue. She feels so cold. Angie keeps telling her to come down, to rest, to be still. But she doesn't. She climbs like this until she is next to the blue diamonds. She reaches deep into the socket and pulls one free with a pop. It rolls over in her palm and looks at her. The wall grumbles and shakes. Sand spews out and glitters in the air. Don't do it.
Angie says. I don't want my old eyes. I like my black opals. The little girl is shivering now. How can eyeballs be so cold? They burn. She reaches in and grabs the other eye. It tries to shake her grip. The monocle loop twists, tries to cut her and steal her blood. The edge sharper than scissors, sharper than her knife. Don't do it, Angie says again. The wall shakes like jelly now. The rumbling gets louder. The girl pulls the eye free. The sand pours like a river where the eyes used to be and rips open the wall. Already there is a pile of golden sand below. The slimy wall slips in her grasp. She grabs for it and again she misses and falls end over end. But the sand catches her. She struggles to her feet and staggers to her sister. As Angie screams, the little girl pries out the black opals and pushes the old eyes in. They're too big at first, but she jams them in, and somehow they work. Then Angie blinks. You beat him, she says. Her lips don't look painted, instead like flesh. But they don't move either. You beat him. Maybe. Just a little. The little girl wonders how her sister's eyes would taste. The sand rages down. The rest of the eyes in the wall spit out on golden jets of dust. Then, just as suddenly, the sand stops. The eyes on the ground stand up, using their black tongues like legs and begin to hop around. The monocle loops are still around them and spin like saw blades. The eyes are hungry, Angie says. We should leave. The sisters stare past the torn wall and into the core of him. They see golden gears, silver levers, teddy bears as big as they are running and running in a turning cage to keep the bellows pumping. A whistle sounds in the fiery vast. Jets of steam wet the air and make it boil. And behind the gears and the grinding and the whistling steam, they hear a clang, 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 constant, never varying. I think that's his heart, the little girl says. It is. I can feel it in my seams. His hungry, starving metal heart. The little girl grabs a gear and starts to climb. The heart is far below them now. She can see it still through the forest of gears, a giant kettle with a metal arm scooping out green soup and pouring it into funnels. Every scoop the arm hits bottom, clang, clang, clang. The soup stinks like rotten meat. She thinks she can see car tires in it, but her stomach still growls. Are you still hungry? Angie says from under the girl's arm. Yes. Are you still thinking about eating me? She doesn't answer. She kicks a gear instead, hoping to hurt him, but the gear doesn't budge. Then she hears a new sound, like a screen door slamming. She sees teddy bears climbing toward her. He sent the bears loose. Run! She kills the first bear near him's skull, cuts its hand off, then stabs it in the heart. The body falls with the knife still wedged in it tight and bounces gear to gear until it hits a catwalk. Splat, a smear of thick green jelly. No fair. He was Apple. Apple's my favorite, Angie says. And I'm hungry too. The little girl stashes the hand in her apron. We'll eat it later, she says. She licks her fingers clean before she climbs and tries not to worry about how she will kill the other bears without a knife. The skull is a hall of mirrors, dark voids full on her own shape, shorter here, fatter there, taller, and then a mirror that turns her body into cubes and moves them around. An eye where her lips should be, her teeth in her throat. She stares. The teddy bears are coming. They're coming. Angie sounds calm. Too calm. Do you want to get away? I don't like being hungry. Easier to be still. The little girl shivers.
Angie is bigger now, heavier. Her hair looks more like straw. The little girl wonders how she will feed Angie when she can't feed herself. They find a ball of lightning bolts hissing and shivering against each other like snakes, each white bolt trying to eat the next until it seems that each one is eating itself. Throbbing heat presses itself into their faces. "Him soul," Angie says. The little girl reaches her hand out toward the snakes of light but doesn't touch. Somehow the lightning is inside her eyes. "He is changing me, Angie, making me into something new." Angie is quiet for a moment. Then, "The bears, they're here." The bears step around a corner wielding sharpened gears tied to sticks, homemade meat cleavers to cleave girl meat. Angie cowers in the corner, shaking. Her hair looks like straw. The little girl is tired and worn too thin. She's seen too much violence, done too much. She doesn't want to hurt anyone anymore. "Don't make me do this," she says to the bears. "Don't make me kill you." A big blue bear with white paws laughs, steps forward. He doesn't have to say he doesn't believe her. He says it by raising the sharp-toothed gear. The little girl grabs a fistful of thunder with her four-fingered hand. The flesh scorches and blackens, smells like burnt bacon. White lightning bleeds inside, turns red. The psalm in her palm pulses loud, a hammer on the ears. The bears freeze mid-step. They see their doom in red lightning. She throws Zeus from the hand of a child. The bears are red ashes then, and the lightning returns and hides inside her hand. Him's skull unfolds outward like paper, white bone origami undone, smoke, the scent of cheesecake. 2 blocks ruined. Houses smoking voids. The swing set charred so it can only limp along on one rusted leg. Doll bodies scattered everywhere, slowly changing to flesh. But him is still and dead. All the many pieces of him strewn and smoking and unmoving. But the little girl can feel her hand tingle, sees the sparks. Because they are starving, she and Angie eat the apple-flavored hand. The girl starts at the pinky, Angie at the thumb. One by one, the stolen children awake, some with their own eyes, some with black opals still, and the 2 sisters tell them, "Don't sit on the swing set, and don't trust your friends, and feed any house before you go in. The world is alive since the magic came back, and children are small and make a good snack, and everything tricks, and everything cheats, and everything
eats."
A game of flashlight tag. Written by William Dalphin. Performed by Jeff Clement. Featuring Luke Fisher and Steve Taylor. Audio production and music by Jeff Clement. When I was 10 years old, I played a late-night game of flashlight tag with a bunch of neighborhood kids. If you don't know what flashlight tag is, it's the same as tag, but you play it in the dark. The person who's it gets a flashlight, and rather than tag you physically, they shine the beam on you, and then they have to yell the name of the person they see with it in order to tag them. It was really cloudy that night, and most people had their curtains drawn, so it was the perfect level of darkness for hiding in. The side of the street my house was on was skirted by a broad length of woods. That was basically the boundary for our side of the game. You could run through any yard, even go across the street and run through their yards, but you weren't allowed to hide in the woods because it was too difficult to find anyone in there, and it was very easy to trip over tree limbs or end up with poison oak. Of course, this rule was frequently and flagrantly ignored when people got too close to being caught. They'd duck off into the bushes for a few seconds or run behind a group of trees to evade capture. I don't remember who was it at the time, but I was hiding in a backyard 2 houses down from my house. The family that lived there had a little playhouse for their daughter, a swing set, and a doghouse, but no dog. I would periodically duck into the doghouse whenever I saw the flashlight's searching beam approaching. Those of us trying to hide from the it person liked to spook each other in the dark by jumping out of nowhere and making each other scream, giving away our positions. I thought I knew where the it guy was, but I got comfortable hanging out on the swing set. Suddenly, a person with a flashlight came around the corner of the house and angled their beam almost directly at me. I leapt from my seat and ran for the edge of the woods. When I got there, I hovered in case they saw me and planned to yell at me for cheating. The beam of light seemed to explore the swing set where I had been, then came in my direction, but there was no sense of hurry at all to it, and I wondered for a second if maybe I'd attracted the attention of the homeowner. Most people on the block knew we were out playing flashlight tag, but you never could be sure that someone wouldn't get nervous if you stayed in their yard too long. So I crouched down in the grass and waited to see who it was. They shined the light right in my face, and I tried to cover it with my hand to avoid identification. The creepy thing was, they never said anything. They just shined that light on me. "You got me," I exclaimed, hoping that if it was a homeowner, they'd realize I thought they were the flashlight tagger. Then I realized that 2 houses down, people were yelling, and there was the it guy's flashlight chasing them around. I stood up and tried to see who was shining the light on me. They just stood there, not moving, not saying anything. I felt a little freaked out.
"If you don't want us playing in your yard, I'll go tell them it's off limits, okay?"
The person started walking toward me. Something didn't feel right, so I started walking toward the edge of the yard. The person just kept shining the light on me and coming toward me. So I ran. When I looked back, the person with the flashlight was running too, and they were an adult, much bigger and much faster than I was. I felt scared, not sure why this person was chasing me. I ran toward where the other kids had been, but they were gone now. It just seemed to be me and the person with the flashlight. So I turned right and ducked into the woods. I dropped to the ground and shook some nearby bushes in an effort to confuse the person, then shimmied under a ring of thick bushes and curled up. I saw the flashlight in the woods nearby, looking around. I heard the person's footsteps, breaking sticks and crunching on pine needles. I didn't know what was going on, and I just wanted to get back to all the other kids. Eventually, the flashlight wandered deeper into the woods, and I crawled, quiet as a mouse, back to the edge of the trees, and then got up and ran toward the street. I was immediately caught by the person who was it, but I didn't care. He yelled loudly that I was now it, and I tried desperately to tell him that there was someone else with a flashlight wandering around in the woods, but he took off in the dark yelling,
"No tagbacks!"
"Don't go in the woods!"
I yelled, but no one responded. Of course, anyone who heard me had probably just assumed I was talking about not cheating at the game, but I was sincerely worried about the adult stranger wandering around in them. Of course, now I had a flashlight of my own, so I thought, I should go and see if I could find out who that was, just to make myself feel better. I went back behind the house I'd come from, and a bunch of laughing shadows scampered out of sight into neighboring yards. I ignored them and headed straight for the trees. I couldn't see any other light in there, so I thought, maybe he went home. I didn't know if it was a man or a woman, but I couldn't imagine any women trudging through the woods at night. So I went about playing the game again, albeit anxious because of the lingering thought that there was someone wandering in the woods who didn't seem to be playing the game with us. I ran across the street and chased people through the backyards there, but after a while I found the lots empty and realized that they must have gone back across the street. I ran back over and was exploring the Beach's backyard. Mrs. Beach had a clothesline with a bunch of drying sheets on it, and her daughter Charlotte liked to hide among the linens and stay close to home in case she got too scared of the dark. She was only a year younger than me. I thought I heard something at the tree line, so I went over and was waving the flashlight around into the woods.
Stay out of the woods!
I remember yelling. I waved the flashlight back and forth a couple more times, then saw someone off in the distance. I held the light on whoever it was. They were about 20 yards into the woods and hard to make out, but it looked to me like Charlotte. Charlotte had brown hair that her mother insisted on keeping shoulder length. We always dressed dark for flashlight tag, and Charlotte liked to wear a deep purple sweatshirt, so it was usually easy to tell when you'd found her.
Charlotte, I see you!
I yelled. She just stood there. I continued to hold the light on her and call her name, but she didn't seem to move. She stood there, partially obscured by a tree, and looked at me. The distance between us was enough that I couldn't see if she was blinking or not, but she had her head propped at an angle, like she was looking around the trunk at me, with her mouth hanging slightly open. Every now and then she sort of twitched or squirmed. It was a real freaky kind of movement.
Charlotte, come out of there!
I yelled.
Everybody! Charlotte's it, but she won't come out of the woods!
Some kids, including my friend Dustin, appeared behind me and formed a chorus, yelling at Charlotte to come out.
Do you see her?
I asked.
Yeah, she's over behind that tree. Charlotte, get over here.
Dustin shouted. But she wouldn't come.
Charlotte, are you okay? Get over here, dummy.
Charlotte seemed to stand up straighter than before, and then disappeared suddenly behind the tree. We could hear movement, but it seemed to be going away rather than toward us. Dustin started shouting Charlotte's name again and trudged into the woods after her. Before he got too far, I grabbed him and gave him my flashlight to take with him. I was scared again, because this all seemed surreal. While Dustin searched the woods, I went to Charlotte's house and knocked until her father answered.
Mr. Beach, Charlotte won't come out of the woods, and I'm worried about her,
I told him. I wasn't sure if he'd take me seriously, but he rolled up his newspaper and disappeared into the closet behind the door for a moment before returning with a huge flashlight strapped to a car battery.
Show me where she is,
he told me, so I led him to the woods and pointed to where I'd seen her.
She was right there,
I said.
By a tree, but she wouldn't come out, and she was acting like she was sick or something.
A bunch of the other kids kept calling Charlotte, and I could see Dustin's flashlight beam moving around through the trees. Mr. Beach went in after him. They explored the woods for a good 15 to 20 minutes, and Mr. Beach started to get real angry. We heard him yelling very loudly for Charlotte, threatening her with all sorts of punishments if she didn't get back in the backyard that instant. The game was over by then, and we kids just stood there in the Beach's backyard, among the linens, and watched. Dustin came running back out of the bushes with a dead flashlight, Eventually, Mr. Beach came back out of the woods.
Game over, kids,
he said.
Get inside. Ask your folks if they can help me and bring flashlights.
We all ran back home. My dad went out with 3 different flashlights. My mother went and turned on all the lights in the back rooms and opened the curtains and shades to help illuminate the backyard. I sat on the couch, all upset, and she eventually came back and hugged me. And she sat with me while I told her about the person with the flashlight chasing me, and how I thought maybe Charlotte had run into him. Mr. Beach had gone inside and called the authorities to report a missing child. The police brought huge lights and did a march through the woods, checking very thoroughly. But they didn't find her. My mother told my dad what I'd told her. He told an officer, and I ended up giving a statement. They went to the house 3 doors down and knocked, but the folks that lived there had been asleep and didn't know who would have been in their backyard. The police asked all up and down the neighborhood, but nobody claimed to know anything. The other end of the woods came to a back road mainly used by logging trucks. They found Charlotte 2 days later on the other side of that logging road at the bottom of an embankment that ended at a stream. She'd been stuffed into a drain pipe. Her neck had been broken, and she'd been stabbed multiple times afterward. My parents weren't the ones to tell me about it. They thought it would upset me. I heard all the details from Dustin at school the next day. That night was the most awful thing our town had ever experienced. On account of what happened to Charlotte, the police blocked off the logging road and spent months tracking down loggers and truckers who frequently used it. There was a curfew for months, and we were told not to play flashlight tag anymore. We didn't argue. What leaves me shaking to this day is the memory of Charlotte's face hanging out from behind the tree, looking at me. Sometimes I wonder if at that moment I had witnessed her death. And I wonder if it had almost been me.
False Prophet by Joshua L. Hood. Narrated by Sarianna Gregg. We all thought Sandra Mandolini hit the bottle after she saw the skinless teenager walk into her room in the middle of the night. A vision like that would have made anyone a little thirsty, so no one really blamed her. Later, we found out that she'd actually taken up brown bottle therapy a few days earlier, on the night that she'd spun her car off the road, killed that kid, and then dumped his body in the canal. Road rash and some hungry fish had done a number on the corpse of Tex Weber. It would have been damn near unidentifiable if Sandra hadn't come along with the details that linked the body to the missing teenager. Sandra claimed that Tex had told her he'd been killed in a hit and run, and that his body could be found at the bottom of the 5th Street Canal. The idiot detectives thought that psychic Sandy had gotten her groove back. She led them to the isolated country road where the accident happened, gave specific details on his dress and description, and ultimately led them to the pump gate where poor Tex had washed up after she'd heaved his hopefully lifeless corpse into the water. She said she'd gotten the info from the ghost of Tex himself. said he'd come walking out of the shadows in the corner of her room and stood at the end of her bed telling her exactly how it happened. No, Tex didn't know who had done it. That part would remain a mystery for some months to come. Very convenient. After the body was recovered, Sandra disappeared into the Red Horn Saloon for several hours. Who could blame her, really? Sandra had nailed some readings in the past. About a year before the incident with Tex, there were a couple of lost campers, a runaway 5-year-old, and the story that started it all, a drunk homeless man crushed by an industrial garbage compactor after he'd crawled in for warmth. That was a total of 3 hits, and never you mind how many misses. A damn good record for any police psychic, and a phenomenal one for a country town made up of cowboys and preachers not prone to being open-minded in parapsychology. It was after the skinless kid that things really started taking off for Sandra. Hit after hit, Sandra was solving crimes at least once a month, and big ones too. It was almost as though the booze was high octane and her psychic powers were a sports car just out of the shop. It wasn't until much later that we figured out how Sandra had gotten so good at what she did, or why so many people were winding up dead. Part of it was our fault. All the damn stories we printed just kept encouraging her. We should have known better. The rest of it was the cops' fuck-up, though they can't really be blamed. There are so few female serial killers, after all. Now, after last summer, you're probably familiar with the name Sandra Mandolini. Her crimes kept the cable news hucksters busy for months. You may remember how she was tormented by one string of killings that she just couldn't solve. Even after all the criminals she'd helped lock away, she just couldn't nail down the needlepoint killer. The experts say that she must have committed at least 9 murders altogether. 6 as the needlepoint killer, and 3 more to cover her tracks. I may just be the local interest columnist, but I pay close attention to this town, and I tell you now that the needlepoint killer had 8 victims. Of course, Sandra never admitted to those last 2, since Sandy wasn't actually the needlepoint killer. She was always cordial to me, despite my constant skepticism of her work. I think it was because she was reaching out to one of the few people who didn't buy into her psychic crime fighter bullshit. She was reaching out to someone who might actually see her for who she was. All the same, I was surprised to get a call one night asking me to meet her at the Red Horn. At this time, she was still riding the media high of finding Tex Weber. The perp was still at large, and I had just published an opinion piece urging the population to stop getting distracted with their hometown heroine and help bring the killer to justice. I'd done a hell of a number on her in that piece. Didn't hold back what I thought of her one bit. I may have been playing up the opposition for my own purposes, I'll admit it. Sometimes it's easier to build a rep by shitting on a local celebrity than actually working hard to find the truth. But that's beside the point. On the phone, she told me that she had another vision of Tex and that she needed a drink. I got to the saloon, and it was clear that she'd beaten me there by several rounds. It was 30 minutes to last call, so I ordered light. She wasn't known for drinking at that point, and I was surprised to see her bowing before so many empties. I told my recorder that the tortured hero on a bar stool look made a great scene for print, but to make sure I didn't fall for it. By the time I made it to the bar, however, I wasn't so sure that it was an act. Something had crawled up and bit Psychic Sandy where it hurt. She was in a bad way. She spent the next half hour telling me some very convincing garbage about how she'd been woken up by the skinless boy again. He told her about the location of L.P. James, the notorious bank robber from 40 years ago who'd made a huge score 2 towns over before disappearing forever. Most of the legend around L.P. James had grown up since that time. Some folks saw him as some sort of Robin Hood and liked to tell big stories about how their grandpa knew the guy. Others said that the mob had found his money and buried him in a shallow grave. There were so many short bus conspiracy nuts out there making up stories about James that I wasn't sold on Sanders' account of how he'd been shot in the leg during his last heist and managed to crawl into an old, unused culvert near some cattle rancher's pond just in time to bleed out. I did, however, admire the balls it took to try and tackle a remote viewing of a folk legend and to a reporter to boot. The booze had clearly overinflated her confidence. A very public fall from grace was coming, or so I thought. She was very matter-of-fact about the whole thing till she got to the point where she'd seen Tex. Then she downed 2 last shots and nearly shook herself off the bar stool with fright. I'd seen her at the canal when they'd dragged up Tex, and even though she didn't look as scared as she was that night, I asked her point-blank why that was. Why so frazzled? Hadn't she already seen Tex's ghost once already? She hesitated and nodded non-committally. She hadn't, of course, seen anything that first time. That was a lie. The second, well, that's when things took a spooky turn. The thrill of being the one to report her crash and burn passed through my mind, but ultimately lost out to pity. Thankfully for my career, I let it go. I told her there was no story here and drove her home. That was Friday. The Sunday edition hit the stands with front page spread of Sandra Mandolini smiling through a hangover and holding up a moldy duffel bag full of L.P. James's money. My editor couldn't decide whether I should be fired or laughed out of town for giving her the write-off, but at least I didn't go negative on the story. That's when I started suspecting something else was really going on. If I'd only known then what the front page didn't show, I would have probably given up any association I'd ever again have with Sandra Mandolini. Rolled up in her purse was a bloody canal water-soaked 8th grade history report written on L.P. James. Written by one Tex Weber, 3rd period, track and field, part-time deceased. The history report didn't say where L.P. James's body was to be found, but on the back was a hastily scrawled map drawn by Sandra Mandolini, a terrified transcription scribbled in the darkness while the ghost of Tex Weber told her of unearthly things. If she wasn't already, Sandra had become an honest-to-God celebrity fortune-teller that day. She didn't call me for a long time after I'd blown her off, but I followed the stories closely anyway. 2 weeks later, she found the body of an old man asphyxiated in his own home by carbon monoxide. The press would eventually claim that Tex's death had given her the taste for blood, and that the old man was just an escalation of her insanity. A tweak to the furnace. Then replace the live battery of the carbon monoxide detector with a dead one. It was all very simple in a town where no one locked their doors at night. At least they didn't before Sandra. 3 weeks later, there was a string of pet nap-ins 2 towns over. Pile of dog carcasses were found under a trestle bridge by none other than Psychic Sandy herself. That one was a matter of urgency. If Sandra's powers hadn't solved the crime, the imminent stench certainly would have. The evening show shrink said she could have gone on for a long time just killing dogs and sick old people if she'd gone undetected, but she had to get the credit while it was still hers to get, and so she escalated again and became the needlepoint killer. A week after the dogs, the needlepoint killer struck for the first time. In their haste to secure their future humiliation, the first thing the police did was to turn to Psychic Sandy for help. She played out all the tricks. Fingers on her temples, crystal on a chain, all of it. But at the end of 2 aggravating hours, came up with nothing. She said she would consult her spirit guide that night, and presumably tried, but Tex wasn't feeling like talking. 3 months later, I met Sandra again while reporting at the scene of the Needle's second murder. It was then that I coined the phrase needlepoint killer. I chose the name because it was both apt for the manner of killing and because it sounded cool. There were obvious similarities in the executions of the two murders, even though the victims had nothing in common. They were both immobilized by a syringe of horse tranquilizer to the back of the neck and then bled out through their carotid artery. Their stomachs and lungs were found filled with their own blood, and their pants were pulled down. That's a pretty obvious pattern. Sandra didn't do much but puke in the corner, looking very convincingly disgusted, I might add, though the smell of whiskey kinda threw off the ruse. It soon became clear that a serial killer was at large in the countryside, and our local psychic was helpless to stop him. She eventually called me again, many months and many crimes later. She said she had been seeing the ghosts of the victims whose crimes she'd solved, not to mention committed, come and go from her house at all times of the night. She'd not slept in weeks, and the booze was getting to her. She asked if she could stay with me for a few days. It was odd that she would choose me. We weren't anything like friends, and surely she had better hookups on the police force. She said that she didn't want them to see her that way. What can I say? I took pity on her. Of course, what she really meant was that Tex had told her to kill me. But how could I know that? Of all the stupid shit the press says, the thing that annoys me the most is when they call me a hero for killing Sandra Mandolini. If you ask me, the real hero's Tex Weber. Think of the grits it must take to drag yourself back from the dead to torment your killer by making her kill more people to come back and haunt her. And on top of that, making her solve the crimes she committed right in front of the authorities so that she'd never get a break from the paranoia of it all. I don't know what he had on her or what a ghost can do to someone who doesn't do what they say, but before she died, she told me that he just kept making her do worse and worse things. They weren't always murder, and the crimes he made her solve weren't always her own. Sometimes, she said, he'd give her a reading that would save someone's life, only to remind her of just how much of a hypocrite she'd become. See, Tex had it all figured out. This could go on forever. No rest for the wicked. This was about a year after Tex. Sandra had become a national sensation in the nutball community of paranormal enthusiasts. Her hot streak was still burning in every regard, except for finding the needlepoint killer. The killer was up to 6 by the newspaper's count. Later victims 7 and 8 would be found in the river, but they'd be too fucked up to be attributed to the needle. The killings were botched, and our Pride neighborhood serial killer didn't want the second-string victims on her lineup. I picked Sandra up from the Red Horn, where she'd become a fixture and a celebrity, though in any other life she would have just been a corner post at the bar. I drank with her for a short time, but saved my wits for the drive home. On the way there, she showed me Tex's history report. She said the blood was on it when he handed it to her that first night because he didn't have any skin. I reminded her that the revelation about L.P. James came from the second encounter with the dead boy and not the first. She didn't say anything. I think she came close to confessing, telling me and the world that she'd made up the first sighting to cover her ass, and that when Tex actually showed up, he had a lot more on his mind than closure. Every time she looked like she would spill the beans, though, she started glancing around like someone who wasn't me was watching her. Once, a glance into the rearview mirror spooked and shut her up for almost 5 minutes straight. It took a long draw from a dented flask to get her feet back under her. I don't know what or who she saw back there, but by that time, the list of possibilities was pretty long. Wasn't until I was stabbing her repeatedly that she choked out her confession. That night, I heard her talking to someone. I'd offered her my room, but she said she wanted to be in the living room where it was less creepy. More doors, a TV, big windows for the street lamps to shine in. It didn't matter about that last part, though, because she kept the lights on all night long. She'd offered to sleep in bed with me, and I realized just how big of a wreck she'd become when I broke it to her that I don't sleep with women, and she almost cried. She'd clearly become desperate. When the voices first started, I thought that she just turned the TV on. I couldn't make out what they said and tried to ignore them. Then it sounded like there was a dog barking in the living room. I was startled awake. It took some time before I realized why the sound disturbed me so much. It wasn't a normal bark. It was angry. But that wasn't all. It sounded strangely distant, like a bark in a tin can. But that somehow cut across the grain of what my ears might call normal hearing. It's hard to explain. I started down the hall to see who was in my living room, but froze before I rounded the corner. It was a full fucking house. There was the old man who she'd asphyxiated, a college student who'd fallen off a balcony, a pile of dead dogs, and, of course, good old Tex Weber, all standing weirdly around Psychic Sandy, who was curled into a praying ball in the middle of my now piss-stained couch. The crowd kind of faded in and out of view. The lights in the living room didn't do nearly enough to illuminate them as they circled rhythmically like kids playing Ring Around the Rosie about the couch. To say I saw them is less correct than to say I felt them through my eyes. In fact, I may not have seen anything at all now that I think back. Maybe the Red Horn has just been doping up their hooch. Maybe I only saw a roofed-up hallucination of what I expected to see after listening to Sandra wax paranoid on a car ride down a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of the night. I don't know, but suddenly I was a believer. The victims of the needlepoint killer weren't there, but of course I know why. I grew anxious and looked around with the sudden fear that I might see those 8 pantsless corpses parading somewhere around in my house, too. They weren't there. I guess they just lacked incentive, or a ringleader like Tex, or maybe they just didn't know who killed them. I was very careful, after all. Probably it was because of Tex that Sandra's victims had come back to her. He was an energetic kid in the prime of his life, a natural leader, and apparently he was a little fucked up in the head, too. When I chose my victims, I chose ones that would have very little fight in them. I guess I did myself a favor there, because they still haven't shown up. The first thing I did was wait for the ghosts to go away. It took until about dawn, but eventually they faded for good. Sandra hadn't seen that I saw, and she began telling me that she knew where another killing was going to take place. Then she started apologizing and telling me that she had to do it, and she'd make it quick. I told her to shut the fuck up. Then I called her a few names that even serial killers don't like to spread around, and slapped her hard across the face. She slapped back, which was enough to get a good fight started. After the living room was convincingly smashed up, I used a butcher knife and went about ending her little reign of terror. She crumpled into a sobbing pile of pain and apologies, spilling all her dark secrets, maybe in hope that a last-minute confession might save her soul or something. She professed over and over that she hadn't done the needlepoint killings, though. Not her. It wasn't her. I told her I knew that, but I don't think she got it. I had no desire to confess myself, so I didn't clarify and just continued with my work. It was not neat. Had to make it look like I was struggling. About halfway through the fight, I looked up and saw Tex in the corner. He was standing at a shadow, looking all sorts of pissed off. His rage was palpable in the room. It was eerie. I got the strong impression that he couldn't do jack about what I was doing because I never did anything to him. His rage was there, but it was somehow not able to get to me. I could tell that Sandra felt it hard, though. She fought like a devil when she saw Tex scowling from the corner. Oh, how she fought. It really sold the act I'd been putting on for the police a half hour later. Damn near gouged out my left eye. When I was done with Sandra, I got all my surgical tubing and syringes and splayed them out on the floor next to her purse. I put Texas history report half under the couch and then injected myself with a few drops of horse sedative from a syringe. I had to rip the needle out halfway through, like I'd caught her in the act. It hurt like hell until the drugs started kicking in. It was potent stuff. A mostly unintelligible 911 call later, and the whole scene fell into place. I told them of how she confessed everything, throwing in a little white lie by adding the needlepoint killings to the mix, though I left out the bit about the 2 bodies in the river. That was my shame. Sure enough, the evidence indicting Sandra was all over the place. The police just hadn't been looking hard enough. They'd gotten lazy with Psychic Sandy on the case and were in a hurry to put their reps back together. 1 week later, I was free from the hospital. A hero. I guess in a way Tex did me a favor. He showed me that I was one bad killing away from ending up as a shriveled husk of a booze hound pissing myself on a stranger's couch. I knew I had to stop, even though I didn't want to. I keep reminding myself that I want less to be haunted by some kid full of bad voodoo than to go about my work. I still don't know what brought Tex back or how he did what he did, but the kid was good at it. I kind of admire him for that. So now, I take it one step at a time. It's getting easier. Mostly. Maybe if I kick the murder habit, I'll quit smoking next. Now I hear that one's real tough. I don't fear that the truth will be discovered anymore. A long time has passed, and Sandy made a good patsy. There are conspiracies, of course, but I'm not afraid of those. After all, no one will suspect me. There really are so few female serial killers.
Off the Beaten Path by Michael Whitehouse. Narrated by Otis Jiry. Robert Francis started the day with purpose and verve. Thrilled by the thought of no drive to work, no gray boring suit or stifled officer, he negotiated the sporadic city traffic with glee. He owned 2 other bikes, but for this adventure would rely upon his favorite and most trusted of wheeled companions. With a custom paint job reading Rob in large white letters across a frame of black, this was a bike which had never failed him. No bumps, no bruises, not so much as a punctured tire. His itinerary was set, and he was filled with excitement at the prospect of finally being on holiday. It had been more than 11 months since he had taken so much as an hour off from his suffocating suit and tie, so the thoughts of spending 8 whole days cycling through the Scottish wilderness with only his backpack and tent for company was frankly exhilarating. Within an hour, he had reached the city limits, breathing a sigh of relief as he left the world of work and sales targets behind. Most of his time was spent in the corporate office blocks of that gray place, but the countryside is where he longed to be, exploring the unbound wilderness. The unpredictable Scottish summer cast its unwelcome interruptions as the busy traffic gave way to winding country roads. It was colder than he had anticipated, but even this could not dampen his spirits. As he made his way through the open countryside, passing the occasional car and rural dwelling, a smile crept across his face. Cycling was his passion, and Robert was in his element. A couple of hours passed as the sparse yet vibrant green grassland soon surrendered to a more imposing and altogether impressive setting. Slight hills rose up to become domineering mountains. Pockets of isolated woodlands soon weaved together into thick and impenetrable forests, and wide-open roads soon constricted into narrower, less-trodden avenues. For the past 3 months, he had been in a quandary about where to go on his adventure, which remote part of Scotland to explore. But when he passed over an old stone bridge with a babbling stream underneath like 1,000 voices whispering for attention, and found himself face to face with a forest covering hills, mountains, and valleys like a blanket, he knew he had made the right decision. A dirt road cut through the labyrinth of trees ahead, winding and twisting for miles. It occurred to Robert that as he cycled further into the forest, the daylight above seemed to diminish with each panting puff of air, blocked by the huge pine trees on both sides, as if the sun were an unwelcome visitor. As the sky darkened, it became clear it was time to stop for the night, so, after spotting a gap in the trees not far from the road, he clambered through some thick underfoot and entangled bushes, hauling his bike and backpack behind him, looking for a suitable resting place. On reaching the clearing, and observing the broken and felled trees which encircled it, he set his tent up for the night on a small pitch of unassuming grass. Before long, he was sitting next to a roaring fire under the stars. Unimpeded by the false light of man, they shone bright and bold above. After a few hours of watching the warm glow of the fire, he reluctantly turned in for the night, excited by the prospect of another day's adventure, another day of distance between himself and the city. That night he slept soundly, but for one ill-defined dream of a noise in the darkness growing louder with each breath. The next morning, he set off as soon as there was daylight. It had rained slightly during the night, and after cycling for an hour, Robert noticed a change in the landscape. It had become increasingly unkempt, less constrained. The trees seemed closer together, and any occasional gaps in the forest scenery were filled by clearings and small fields which had been left unattended for some time. It became clear that he had traveled far enough into the forest that he was now out of reach of even the park rangers who would normally maintain such a place. It seemed as though beyond that point, the land had been neglected by its carers. The thought that even those familiar with that wilderness were afraid to tread there weighed on his mind momentarily before being quickly dismissed as a flight of fancy. The sky dulled as the day wore on, and it was clear that rain was on its way once more. After pushing his bike up a steep incline, which he felt was too uneven to cycle on, Robert reached its peak, revealing another breathtaking change in front of him. The land spread out to the horizon, sprawling forward between pockets of woodland and stagnant pools of water, slumbering in a deep-set valley which stretched across an ancient basin for miles below. With brooding storm clouds above, he looked down at the valley and decided it would make sense to set up camp early. Not a half hour later, he had descended and stood in a wide circle of grass, and after putting his tent in place, all that was left was to gather some firewood. The only problem was that Robert had picked a camping spot dominated more so by bushes and shrubs than trees. He would have to venture out across the valley and find what he needed from one of the wooded areas nearby. A collection of pine and fir trees, which formed an isolated island of woodland about a half-mile across, was close enough to the camp. After 10 or 15 minutes of trudging through the long grass, occasionally sinking his feet unwittingly into remnants of a marshy bog, Robert found himself at the edge of the woods. Its boundary was dominated by older trees, which had long since withered, covered by thick brown hanging moss, nature's own burial shroud. The broken trunks of once beautiful and majestic pines and sycamores littered the ground, open and rotting from the inside, not unlike a decomposing animal. It occurred to Robert that the woods seemed somehow out of place. The trees did not belong to the landscape as others did. The long grass, which characterized the entire area, seemed to thin out and change from a healthy natural green color to a morbid yellow-brown. As his thought ruminated, a accompanied by an increasing sense of unexplainable dread, he realized that he was looking at a large dead ring of grass which followed the tree line perfectly, encircling the pocket of woodlands as if marking the limits of a tomb. On their own, in a forgotten part of the world, many would have been cautious of such a sight, but Robert quickly shook off his initial sense of vigilance, finding the area intriguing, a place unlike any he had seen before. With a bold stride, he stepped over the woodland threshold into the dim light within. On the forest floor, he could see many relics of past trees slumped on the ground. As he continued inward, the canopy above grew increasingly thick with each step, sheltering everything from the rain. Scanning the ground for firewood, he looked up and noticed that while it was daylight outside, the woodland trees were now blotting the sun from the sky. Had he not known better, he would have sworn it was dusk. At last, he found a collection of broken branches and logs which were dry. Robert knew this was as far as he should go, as it was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate through the trees, which seemed to be growing closer together, their branches often interlinked and touching as if trying to keep those inside from escaping. "Don't be silly," Robert smirked to himself. It had started to rain, and although he could hear the drops of water pelting off of the leaves above, his surroundings were perfectly dry. It made sense to make his way back and get a fire started as soon as possible, because once everything was wet, it would prove increasingly difficult to do so. He quickly gathered the last of the wood up into his arms, but just as he turned to leave and follow his own tracks on the pine-covered floor out of the unnerving woods, something caught his eye. Several feet away, obscured by a ring of trees particularly close to one another, there appeared to be a strange arrangement of stones on the ground. Robert, being Robert, he just had to investigate. After clawing his way through a net of branches, he found himself staring at what looked suspiciously like a grave. Hundreds of uneven gray stones the size of a fist, and some substantially bigger, had been piled on top of one another, about 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, and a couple of feet off the ground. It looked as though a mourner had marked the resting place of a body. A shudder crept up Robert's spine as he momentarily experienced a feeling of being watched, but quickly dismissed the fear, replacing it with curiosity. Nearby, he noticed that lying around the stones was a collection of randomly scattered belongings. Several empty beer cans lay strewn on the floor. A jumper covered in rotting leaves sat on the ground, while a sleeping bag, scraps of newspaper, and even some old food cans betrayed the grave for what it really was: someone's campsite. Robert breathed a sigh of relief and surmised from his surroundings that a few students had probably been there in the summer, got caught in the rain, moving into the woods to remain dry. The stones were probably just placed there out of boredom, or even as a prank to creep out any passerby in the future. University summers really were great, Robert thought, casting a fleeting eye back to memories of summer trips with his friends. One thing about the stone configuration intrigued him, however. Sticking out between these two plain gray rocks on the side of the pile was a rock which appeared to be markedly different from the rest. Triangular in shape, it was wider than a human hand, smooth in places, and not dissimilar to black marble, tapering off to a dull point at one end. Before he really considered it with any degree of scrutiny, Robert dropped the firewood, bent over, and tugged at the stone. It felt polished and cold in his hands, but it seemed to not wish to leave its home, wedged as it was so tightly amongst the other rocks. Growing slightly exasperated, he wrapped both his hands around the stone and finally, with an exerted judder backwards, was free. Staring at it intently, it looked suspiciously like an ancient axe head. Whether it was or not, Robert was not qualified to answer, but it certainly looked like a man-made object, and he could see chisel marks along its side. Perhaps the previous campers found it nearby and then used the rock in their construction without knowing of its significance. He was excited by the prospect and knew instantly that on his return home he would ask a friend of his, who studied archaeology at university, whether it was what he suspected or not. After examining the object for some time, Robert was reminded by the sound of rain above that he really should make his way back to the campsite. Pocketing the stone, he bent over to pick up the firewood, but as he did so, he heard a noise. It appeared as though one of the stones on the pile had slid off and landed on the ground. A creeping sense of unease slowly started to exert itself upon his nerve, one which he could not explain. Picking up the firewood quickly, leaving the rest of the stones unmoved, he began to make his way back. With every step, something deep within was telling Robert that he was no longer alone, and worse, that he was being followed by someone in the woods. But with several nervous glances over his shoulder, he could see nothing. There were moments when he even fancied that he heard the sound of twigs and pines cracking underfoot, but again, no one was there. Breathing a sigh of relief, the tree line came into view, and Robert was filled with cheer, knowing that within a few moments he would be back out in the open air. But just before he reached the periphery of the woods, he heard a crack again. This time it was definite. It was louder than before, more pronounced, and accompanied by the hairs on the back of his neck rising in unison. He was convinced that someone was standing just a few feet behind, staring at him. Caught between the fear of knowing and the fear of not, he finally turned around slowly. Yes, there it was. He saw it. Only for a moment, but he saw it. An arm or a shoulder, something disappearing behind a tree nearby. Robert's mouth grew dry, making it difficult to swallow, and his heart started to thud deep within his chest. He began to backpedal slowly, hoping that he would not trip on an unseen root or weed on the floor, leaving him vulnerable on the ground. With each step, the woods grew lighter, and as he neared its edge, the light from outside bathed its interior in a bluish hue. He did not take his eyes off the large sycamore trunk where that shadowy figure seemed to be hiding, not for one moment. It was peculiar, but an overpowering sense of safety out in the open dominated his thoughts. Normally a person feels exposed and vulnerable in the open wilderness, but not Robert, at least not in that situation. As he edged slowly toward the grassy plain outside, the subtle, foreboding sound of leaves rustling and swaying almost in anger progressed into a crescendo of noise. But there was no wind to gust, no breeze to disturb. There was only one conclusion to be reached. Something was moving towards him. And then he was outside, out of the woods, away from whoever had been following. No, not following, stalking him. Robert was not a superstitious man. You could not afford to be when camping alone in such remote locations, as the mind tends to play tricks, twisting the benign sounds of nature into something much more malevolent. But regardless, he did not wish to stay around long enough to find out who his unwanted companion in the woods had been. Dropping all but the sturdiest piece of wood, which he reckoned would make a good makeshift weapon, he ran as fast as he could toward his own camp, all the while glancing back at that strange island of trees surrounded by dead, withered grass. But nothing emerged from it. Arriving at his tent, out of breath and agitated, he packed up his belongings as quickly as possible, then carried his bike up a small hill and back onto the dirt path. Waiting not one moment longer, he cycled hard and fast, hoping to put as much distance between himself and that place and its unseen resident, before finding somewhere safer and more welcoming to camp. The road was now nothing but a single track of mud, which covered Robert in a shower of dirt every time his bike sloshed through an uneven depression on the ground. The weather was bitter, unusually so at that time of year, and the rain, accompanied now by a freezing wind, battered his face, making each foot of distance traveled feel like 100. He tried to continue for as long as he could, hoping to leave the necessity of making camp until the last usable ray of sunlight. But after a couple of hours, the skies opened further and the rain came down in sheets. He had to find shelter, and quick, concluding that he had put at least 15 or so miles of winding, difficult track between himself and that bizarre coven of trees. Regardless of whether it felt enough or not, it was simply impossible to continue due to the elements. On the left-hand side of the path, there was a rather steep drop which led down into a large field, but it would not provide the shelter Robert knew he required. To his right was a humble gradient of grass which rose up into a large stretch of woodland. Following his strange experience from earlier, some hesitancy did present itself to him, but the horrendous weather soon increased the motivation for shelter, and after pulling his bike up through the grass, he entered the tree line. The torrential rain filtered through the tree canopy, and it took a while before Robert could locate a suitable spot to camp. Finding a large bush under several tightly knit fir trees, he pitched his tent there, and then, as the area remained relatively protected from the storm outside in the open, using some dried roots, grass, and twigs from the forest floor, he was able to start a small campfire which allowed him to cook some food while raising his spirits. Night began to close in, and as the wind and rain diminished, the sound of sausages sizzling in a frying pan on the fire provided the first sense of well-being and comfort that he had experienced since the morning. Thinking over his experience in the woods, he began to rationalize the events. He had found various belongings in there, a sleeping bag, clothes, fruit, and beer cans. It was obvious now that he had just disturbed a fellow camper. Someone who no doubt became frightened, seeing another human being wandering around the campsite in the middle of nowhere. That must have been it. The man, and he was reasonably sure it was a man from the little he had seen of him, probably hid behind that tree because he was simply scared or unnerved. Robert relaxed into a sigh of relief, but just as he did so, he slipped his hand into his jacket pocket. Touching its cold black surface, he had completely forgotten about the unusual stone he had picked up from that collection of oddly arranged rocks. Removing it from his jacket pocket and observing it in the low red light of the campfire, Robert was certain that it had been shaped by human hands. It felt old, ancient even, but he would wait to contact his archaeologist friend before getting his hopes up too much. He would have to admit, though, that the idea of finding a relic from the past was something which thrilled him deeply. Since he was a child, he had always obsessed by hidden or undiscovered history, which perhaps explained his fascination with exploring the Scottish countryside, a land steeped in stories and myths of strange and forgotten peoples. Above all else, he hoped that it was of Pictish origin, that mysterious indigenous people who vanished without a trace over 1,000 years ago, something which historians still pondered and puzzled over. Of course, in all probability, it was a modern replica, but the romantic side of Robert's personality hoped that it was so much more, and enjoyed entertaining that hope. As he stared at the relic, something unusual began to filter into his awareness, something different. Above the crackling sound of the fire, the now subtle wind, and the occasional rustle of a woodland animal nearby, came a noise. It was distant. How far, Robert could not tell, but it echoed through the ridges and valleys nearby, scattering through the trees in the dark. It repeated again and again, with only a moment's pause between utterances, and it was an utterance of some description. An animal, perhaps? Robert could not identify it despite his impressive knowledge of the local wildlife. The sound possessed strange characteristics of a creature unknown to him. In some ways, it was reminiscent of a bird of prey, parts high-pitched and shrieking, but under this lay a painful, wretched noise more akin to that of a fox crying in the night looking for its young. That was it exactly. It sounded like it was looking for something. For the next 3 hours, Robert lay awake, listening to the screeching noise ebb and flow as whatever was producing it moved closer, then farther away. As he eventually drifted towards sleep, the thought occurred to him that the movement of the sound was not unlike that of a search party, yelling and shouting, looking for someone lost in the wilderness, following a distinct search pattern. In the cold light of day, the noise was gone, and while he had accepted that what had scared him the day before was simply a timid camper, cautious of a nearby stranger, he could still not shake a feeling of impending dread deep from the pit of his stomach. The day passed quickly, and while he made good progress, he did not do so with the delight he had previously felt. Something toxic lay in his mind, just outside of his awareness, something which suffocated his spirits. That night again he camped in a clearing, and yet again that same horrible shriek came out across the wilderness looking for something lost, something precious, shrieking with one subtle difference from the night before. It was closer. Sleep did not come easy once more, and Robert fancied that during the night he had heard footsteps nearby, but attributed these to the simple nocturnal wanderings of a lonely deer or stag. While the following day remained overcast and gray, the wind and rain were gone, both a distant memory, but for the occasional accumulation of water on the dirt track. Robert cycled onward, negotiating a network of paths, while realizing that he had strayed from his intended route at some juncture. Despite this, he was confident he knew where he was, and this unanticipated change would simply be a small detour and nothing more. At times, he made great progress when the ground was even enough, stopping occasionally to take in a variety of delving valleys and rising peaks. Uncharacteristically, however, he kept his distance as much as he could from the woods and forest which often accompanied the road, while dismissing it as merely his imagination. At times he felt like there was something within them, peering out from the dark, watching. It was late afternoon, and he was beginning to feel tired, probably most due to a restless night, combined with the unrelenting pace he had set himself throughout the day. In the back of his mind, he was still running from something, fleeing an unseen, ominous threat. The path he had been on for the past couple of hours had been rather predictable for the most part, but now it curved sharply around a grassy hill to reveal a change in the landscape which had been previously hidden from view. A long stretch of dirt and uneven track penetrated a thick forest of fir trees. What Robert found interesting about the path was that it was unnaturally straight, and what he found oddly frightening about it was that it was so narrow, only a couple of feet across. Both sides of the forest only an arm's length apart. This proximity provoked deep feelings of overexposure and claustrophobia. If he had been a soldier in a war zone, Robert would have highlighted this long, narrow path as the perfect place for an ambush. Standing with his mountain bike only a few feet from the beginning of both forest and track, he felt uneasy about the current situation. It was clear that the path was the only way forward, and while it appeared as though it exited the forest a few miles from his position, there was something inherently dubious about it. What? He could not tell, but he did feel that he did not wish to traverse it. Weighing the pros and cons, he realized that both the way he came and the unknown land ahead provoked trepidation in him. For that reason, he dismissed the sense of dread as a figment of his overactive imagination, and with measured movement, slowly set off down the long, straight track, hoping to quickly pass in and out of the forest without incident. A black cloud hovered above, and as Robert negotiated the overly uneven path as quickly as he could, the feeling of foreboding, which he had so nonchalantly dismissed, began to ferment in his stomach, rising up through his body, forcing the hairs on his arm to stand on end. He kept his head down for the most part, occasionally glancing ahead at what he assumed was his exit in the distance. He just wanted to be through and out of that place as quickly as possible, the trees closing in on either side, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Just over halfway down the path, an unnerving and unwelcome familiarity overtook him. A sensation which had accompanied him for days, but now seemed to be sharper, grating more profoundly on his nerves, filled his every thought, the feeling of being watched. Stopping for a moment to catch his breath, he tried, as best he could, to shake the immovable sensation that he was not alone. The path stretched out ahead, and as is common amongst those who attempt to reach a goal or threshold, without thinking, he looked back to measure his own progress. He had managed to cover a substantial amount of the track's length, and was quite confident that in a short time he would escape the narrow stretch of dirt. But just as he turned to continue onward, something caught his eye farther down the path in front of him. He immediately wished that he had not taken the route he had chosen, that he had turned back and started homeward. It was there, unmistakable, unwavering, and utterly paralyzing. Some distance away in the direction he was heading stood a figure. He could not entirely make out the discrete features of the individual because they were standing to the side of the path between a cluster of trees, covered in shadow, but it was there, no doubt, and was certainly a product of his imagination. Someone was standing there watching, and while Robert was a distance away, it felt to him as though the figure's presence was almost on top of him. Its stare, accompanied by an uncommon, potent sense of, malice was the best way that Robert could describe it to himself. Then it was gone, disappearing back into the forest. But the feeling of danger, of the necessity to flee, did not diminish or decline, but grew in intensity. The sound of something moving between the trees rang out across the emptiness, increasing in volume as it neared. Robert panicked, turned, and cycled as quickly as he could in the direction he had come. So eager was he to escape that narrow passage flanked on all sides by the impenetrable forest that he did not see a deep hole in the ground. The front wheel of his bike crashed into the depression, sending him flying over the handlebars, scraping along the ground. Dazed for a moment, the shambling sound of broken branches and displaced leaves, which was nearly upon him, brought his mind back into abrupt focus. Blood dripped from a wound in his leg, and his arm was badly bruised from the impact, but all he cared about was escaping from that suffocating path away from whoever seemed to be moving in the woods. Robert's beloved paint job, including the letters Rob on the bike's frame, had been scratched slightly in the crash, but that did not concern him. 2 spokes on the bike's front tire were broken, and that most certainly did. The last thing he needed was to be completely stranded there, so he would have to ride carefully and hope that the wheel would not buckle, lasting long enough to carry him home. Home. That was exactly where he intended to go, as quickly and directly as possible, as he was now facing in the direction he had been traveling for days. There was no time like the present. The moving sound in the trees continued, and as Robert carefully, yet at pace, negotiated the broken ground, he hoped above all else that his trusted mountain bike would get him out of there. Despite his obvious advantage of speed, the sound seemed to be only moments behind, and as he came closer to the end of the forest path and out into the open, he heard a noise which chilled him to his very core. From within the dark recess of trees spewed that same shrieking, tortured cry from the nights before, echoing out, piercing Robert's ears and scratching through his nerves. Was it that figure who had been wandering near his camp at night? Surely no human could make such a sound. Panicking, he increased his speed as the front tire of his bike wobbled and creaked under the pressure and strain. Finally, he was out of that narrow place, but he did not stop, cycling for hours without once looking back, Only when sure that his pursuer could not have followed did he stop to rest. Night was once again drawing in, and now every sound, every smell, every part of what had always made the countryside fascinatingly inviting to him took on a new, ominous, and menacing form. The remoteness, the solitude, to be left alone far away from the buzzing lights of the city. He decided that tonight he would not set up camp. No fire, no tent. Robert was sure that the person following him had been able to do so because of the noise and light which he had made from night to night. It would not be pleasant. It would be cold, wet, and uncomfortable, but he wanted to make sure that he could not be tracked. There were various paths and dirt tracks in the area that he could have taken, but hopefully the man who was stalking him, for whatever reason he was doing so, would not be able to find him again. Robert knew, of course, that his tire tracks could easily betray his location if his pursuer was smart enough to follow them. The bike marks were obvious. For this reason, he backtracked for several minutes off the path in an attempt to confuse anyone following should the need arise. The worst thing he could do would be to sleep next to where his tracks ended. Finding a large bush with space underneath to sleep, he hid himself and his bike for the night, with one question on his mind. If this stalker was able to keep up with his progression each day, he must have been using a bike or vehicle of some description. But where were the tire tracks? Sleep did not come at all that night, but around 3 a.m, that wailing, inhuman noise did, moving around the area, searching. By now, Robert was beginning to suffer from lack of rest, but in spite of this, at the first sign of daylight, he quickly uncovered his bike from its hiding place and started on his way once again. Not one foul noise was heard that day, nor any evidence that his stalker was nearby. Rationality began to overtake Robert's fear as night once again settled in. He had covered much ground throughout the day and had managed to take care as best he could of his bike's front wheel, which, bar the occasional creak or groan, was performing admirably. He concluded, after much soul-searching, that he had allowed himself to get carried away by the isolation of his surroundings and the admittedly unnerving person he had seen in the forest over the past few days. But surely it was preposterous to believe that he was really being followed. Perhaps the individual he had seen was not the same as the one he had encountered at that strange island of trees. It would make more sense that it was, in fact, just another camper. Maybe there were a few of them in the valley, and as for the unfamiliar animal screeching at night, it must just have been a species of bird in the area which he had never heard before. That night Robert would set a campfire. He would cook his food, eat well, and enjoy the solitary countryside as he had intended to for such a long time since planning his holiday. After locating a suitable spot in the forest, that was exactly what he did. He cooked on a roaring campfire and sat for hours gazing at the night sky through the branches of the trees above. There were no noises, no strange shrieks, no shambling footsteps in the darkness. Nothing. Confident that his unwelcome traveling companion had been left far behind, he retired to his tent, exhausted, in much need of a well-earned rest. 2 paltry hours of sleep later, however, Robert woke to the sound of something stirring outside. He had left the campfire burning as he was uncomfortable in spending another night in darkness, and its flames seemed to dance, shifting and changing shape in the night air, casting shadows all around onto the thin canvas of the tent like a naturally occurring cinema screen. But it cast one shadow in particular which dominated the others, that of someone sitting by the fire. Robert froze. His mouth went dry, and his breathing became shallow and anxious. He could not believe that he had been so stupid to persuade himself that no one was following him. In lighting another fire, he had led the stalker directly to where he slept, and now they had the upper hand. God only knew what they wanted. After a moment of utter terror, Robert realized he needed to defend himself. Sitting up slowly and pulling off his sleeping bag and out from under him as quietly as possible, he scanned the tent looking for something he could cannibalize as a weapon. But anything of any weight was in his backpack. A metallic torch, the wood he had taken days earlier, a glass bottle, etc. And he had stupidly left that outside of the tent. He cursed himself for being so reckless, and could scarcely believe that he had left his bag outside when he always kept it inside, away from rain and wild animals. Exhaustion was his only explanation, but that did not help his current circumstances at all. Then he remembered the old axe head, the black rock he had found at the stranger's camp. Indeed, if it was a hand axe as he suspected, he reckoned it could still deal a nasty, perhaps even fatal blow. Running his fingers along its once sharp ridges, Robert composed himself, never for a second taking his eyes off of the flickering shadow in the tent wall. The door to the tent was luckily unzipped, but the two flaps from the outer fly sheet were draped over the entrance, obscuring his view. With one eye, he peeked through the slit between the canvas slowly. There it was. Someone sitting at the campfire. By his build, Robert was certain it was a man. The backlight of the fire made it difficult to decipher any of his features, but the shoulders were broad, strong, and it was clear that this man had been in the wilderness for some time, as it appeared that he was wearing rags of cloth which hung loosely around him. His head was covered in long strands of black wet hair, which had clumped together in places, presumably because it had not been washed for some time. Staring at the rear of the man's head, Robert tried as best he could to subdue his fear. He thought that he could conceivably sneak up behind him and knock him out with a blow to the back of the head with the black stone, but that could be murder, and Robert did not even know if the man was violent. Perhaps he was a nomadic type, a gypsy, a traveler. Yes, maybe it was best to wait. Maybe he would just wander off into the woods, although that seemed unlikely. Just as Robert affirmed to himself that if the man made a move toward the tent, he would rush out into the open and fight him head-on, he noticed something. Something was odd about the way the man was sitting. First of all, he was sitting still. So still that anyone would have been forgiven for mistaking him for a shadow. Not the slightest movement was made, nor was there any indication of life at all. No subtle shifting of weight, no rising and falling of breath, nothing. While the stillness was unnerving, it was Robert's second observation which bothered him the most. The man was sitting forward facing the fire, but the shape and position of his upper body and head was somehow off. They did not seem to quite add up. His frame seemed unnaturally positioned. A crackle from the fire, followed by a wayward flicker of light, revealed the truth. The flames lit up the area momentarily, the light bouncing from tree to tree, even onto Robert's tent, and reflecting back onto what surrounded it. 2 pinpoints of light momentarily shone in the night through black clumps of matted hair. Yes, the man's legs were facing the fire, but his body and his head were horribly contorted, twisted into an inhuman posture. The man's legs were indeed facing the fire, but his head and body were facing Robert. This was no man at all. How long it had sat there staring at the tent, waiting, he did not know. But a creak of movement from its neck was enough to send Robert out of the tent into the woods, consumed by a terror so profound that it could be likened to madness. He did not know how long he had been running, nor if he had been screaming the entire time, but his feet were cut in several places, and the first ray of sunshine were peeking out through the still thick branches of the forest. In the distance, Robert could see the flames from his campfire still burning bright, and despite his terror at the knowledge of being stalked by someone entirely inhuman, he had to get his bike to stand any chance of escape. For a while he hid behind trees, under bushes, his nerves absolutely shattered, refusing to go near the fire. His preconceptions were broken, but Robert was a strong character, and after a time, a modicum of composure returned to him. Step by cautious step, he neared his own camp. There was no sight of whatever had been sitting at that fire staring at him. By now, daylight illuminated the wider area, and after much self-bargaining, Robert decided to reclaim his belongings, grab his bike, and quickly continue as he could on his way out of the wilderness back to the city. Everything seemed to be accounted for, and even allowed himself a smirk at the thought that the creature, at least not being a thief. That sight soon vanished at the sight of the bike, however. Unharmed, yes, but strands of a black putrid liquid covered the seat and front wheel. This was not a time to be concerned with sludge on his means of escape. It was still working, and that was all that mattered. Had it been a week earlier, Robert would have been angry about the slightest scratch to his beloved mountain bike, but now he just cared about it getting him home, or at least back to Aberfoyle Village, to civilization. After clearing the liquid off and packing up his tent, Robert once more continued onward as fast as he could. He reckoned, with a hard push, that he could be out of that horrid place in a day and a half, as long as he took minimal rests and cycled for the duration of available light. The weather was not exactly ideal, but while rain occasionally came, it quickly disappeared, leaving long stretches of the journey clear from the wearing effects of the elements. As the day progressed, so did Robert's unease. He felt oppressed on all sides, as if he were running from something terrible, yet nearing an undefined danger. A horrible realization bubbled up from his unconscious. What if that thing followed him all the way home? As this thought swirled around in his mind, he passed over the crest of a hill and down again, suddenly realizing what was wrong and why he was feeling so much unease about what lay ahead. A gulf in the land opened up before him. Pockets of stagnant water lay strewn between stretches of marshland and long grass, and in the center there lay that horrible island of wretchedness. It was the woods where Robert first saw his pursuer, and then in a flash it all made perfect sense. Call it superstition, call it blind stupidity, whatever you would call it, Robert knew that he did not wish to see that twisted man again. As a child, he had been told ghost stories of people disturbing graves and the graves of dead rising up to haunt the living, but he never took much stock in such things. Not until then, at least. What he did know was that he had inadvertently triggered the whole terrifying ordeal. He had taken something which did not belong to him. After hiding his bike in the long grass, he trudged toward that isolated pocket of woodland where he now knew to be a grave lay, minus one oddly shaped black stone which he had been carrying with him ever since the ordeal had begun. He half expected for that thing to be sitting next to its resting place, but while there was a number of strange noises and movements between the trees, there was no sign of Robert's unwelcoming traveling companion. He assumed it was still out there looking for him. Wasting no time, he plunged into the woodland and headed straight until finally finding the grave, that elongated pattern of stacked rocks and stones. After locating the gap where he had torn the black stone from, he wedged it back in tightly. A noise echoed from the other side of the woods, and Robert did not wish to hang around to find out what it was. Running as fast as he could over the roots, mud, leaves, and fallen branches, he jumped out of that dark place into the open outdoors, filled with a sense of accomplishment and utter relief. It was not long before he was back on the dirt path, moving forward on his bike in search of one more place to sleep for the night, then home the next day. A weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew he had unwittingly disturbed something unimaginable, unfathomable, but by returning that which he had taken, he had narrowly escaped what he assumed would have been a terrible fate, death, or perhaps worse. There was no explanation of this feeling of elation and survival. He just knew deep down that he had righted his wrong. That night Robert lay in his tent. It was dark, as he had decided against campfire, just to be on the safe side. He was confident that he would be left alone, however, and took great comfort in knowing that he was safe, while looking forward to the next day and the comforts of home. It was a funny thought. A man who had always adored the countryside, detesting the humdrum of daily city life, relishing the idea of a couch, a television, a beer, and a warm bed. Next year, he would holiday at a sunny resort and lie on a beach for a couple of weeks, one preferably far removed from his homeland. Robert closed his eyes with a smile on his face and drifted off. The noise, which he had heard outside for so many nights, suddenly screeched at a blood-curdling and overpowering volume. Without having to open his eyes, he knew. The sound did not come from the woods. It came from inside the tent. Robert Francis was never seen or heard from again. Scotland is old. It has an ancient and hidden history of peoples and places long forgotten. But perhaps some trace remains, isolated and alone in the bitter wilderness. So, should you ever wish to wander the hills, forests, or lochs of this old country, bear one thing in mind. If you find a collection of stones heaped together, not unlike a grave, and they are surrounded by trinkets of modernity, a sleeping bag, food cans, or perhaps even an old bike with the name Rob etched onto it, walk on. Do not look back. Do not touch anything, whether it's an unusual black stone or a simple piece of forest wood. Above all else, most certainly never take a souvenir, for those who lie in slumber nearby may just take one from you.
Chilling tales for dark nights.